I'm Ralph Preston, and we're back for another roadmap. But this week we have a little surprise for you, and that is we have a guest. Usually it's just William and I, but we felt this subject warranted a guest, and that would be Dr. Bruce Hetzler, who's a neuroscientist who also, like William and I, unfortunately suffered a stroke and has had to deal with his own recovery. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about mental imagery or mental practice. And this is something that worked well for me in my recovery to get my hand going. And I told people about the process for about 10 or 12 years before I met Dr. Hetzler. I always felt like I was crazy telling him, people thought I was crazy telling him, well, just stare at your hand and see if you can open it, and maybe you'll get what William calls a flicker of movement. And if you do, you can build on that. You know, because I thought it was kind of crazy when they told me at the rehab hospital, well, just stare at your hand in my video. In fact, I thought they were a little crazy, but I didn't have a better plan. In fact, I didn't have a plan at all. So I tried it and it worked for me. And then about 12 years later, a couple of years ago, I had Dr. Hetzler on as a guest in one of our Tuesday shows, and I asked him about it, and I found out it's called mental imagery, mental practice. It actually worked for me. It works for a lot of people. It's been studied, and so we're going to start this off by asking Dr. Hetzler to give us a little background on mental practice and anything else he wants to toss in about how it works. So, Dr. Hetzler.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Mental practice basically involves cognitive imagery or cognitive performance of a task with the goal of improving later actual physical performance of that same task. And its use began around the year 2000. And the person that started it did so on the basis of what he had observed with swim teams. That is, people on swim teams would think about their swimming at night, say the night before a meet, and that would improve their performance at the meet. So he got a grant and did some research on it. And the original research involved making 20-minute cassette tapes that were then given to participants, and the tapes would walk them through a guided mental imagery session. And that, it was found, would help them. Those cassette tapes are long unavailable. However, on the stroke recovery blog, Stronger After Stroke, by Peter Levine, that's Levine, on his blog, in the home page, if you go to the upper right-hand corner, there is a link for audio recordings that will take you through mental imagery. There are about a dozen of them. So if you're interested in this topic, you could listen to one or more of those to help you get started.
That's interesting because I didn't know about those kind of tapes or resources, but I found it difficult to stay on track. Your mind tends to wander, and something when you're trying to stare at your hand and open it that you want to keep your mind on task. So that's interesting. William, I think you and I've talked a little bit about other athletes to this. Maybe I think Usain Bolt has talked about maybe a little bit about mental imagery. I know that track and field athletes often think about coming out of the blocks, especially in sprint races. In fact, sometimes if you see them, they'll actually practice it a few times. Of course, when you can already do something, that's a little different than trying to imagine yourself doing it to get back voluntary motion when you can't move, but it's still the same type of, I would have to assume, I'm not the neuroscientist, that, when an athlete practices something like that, I found when I pattern myself like that in my stroke recovery stuff, that I do much better right after I pattern. If I'm like patterning myself, light touching something and then try it. If I try not holding on, then light touch something and then try it again, the patterning by light touching, it helps me do it a lot better the second time. So there's definitely something to brain patterning too. William, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, sure, definitely. I think I think mental imagery, I mean, like Bruce said, it originated from obviously athletes who wanted to perform a lot better. I know, I know, and I know, I mean, at least in my personal life, because I used to be a basketballer. Sometimes when I used to shoot the basketball in front of someone who had never shot a basketball before, the other person initially they wouldn't be able to shoot the basketball very well, but after they observed me, they could actually shoot a little bit better. Um, and I think that's because, well, I wouldn't say that's more of a mental imagery. I think because your brain obviously learns from experience-dependent plasticity, which is basically a fancy term to describe that your brain learns mainly from, you know, immersing itself in the experience of, what something looks like and feels like. I think when your brain is exposed to what something should look like, such as a movement, um, it uses this as a reference point on how to improve itself. And in the case of mental imagery, I suspect that this is what is kind of happening, because when your brain can actually connect the dots by seeing something visually, um, it too and it too can also do the same. And the studies have also shown, and Bruce, you can probably talk more about this. The studies have shown that when your brain when your brain mentally rehearses a movement, the same part of the brain which is responsible for that movement, it lights up as if you were doing that movement yourself, even though you don't even have that movement. So I think at least I think it's actually a quite powerful in stroke recovery because after a stroke, your brain needs something to connect the dots, and it needs something to teach itself how to send those signals out again to learn how to get back what was lost. And if you can give your brain that reference point, especially in the form of mental imagery, whatever feedback you have, whether this is mental practice or actual doing the action exercise with whatever movement you have, then that can actually help your stroke recovery.
Yeah,
So
if I could just follow up on what you said, William, there are studies that have examined with fMRI records, that stands for functional magnetic resonance imaging. And basically, what that is a measure of blood flow to parts of the brain. The more blood flow to an area, the more oxygen that part of the brain is getting. And a part of the brain that's doing more work needs more oxygen. So the fMRI readings show you how active a brain area is by virtue of how much blood it's getting and how much oxygen it is using. So if you look at the same person performing an action versus seeing someone else performing that action versus imagining themselves performing that action, you see the same parts of the brain light up. That is, have more oxygen flow and more activity. So all three of those procedures activate the same motor schema, the motor representation for performing that action. And that's why mental imagery will help improve your functioning after stroke.
Great. Well, that's one reason we have these conversations. I always learn something. Um, before we started recording, we were talking about the mirror neurons, the fact that I guess they're coming into play here, Dr. Hetzler.
Yes, the so-called mirror neurons weren't discovered until the 1990s in a research laboratory in Italy. The researchers were looking at monkeys, and they were recording from single neurons in the monkey's brain. And they would find a neuron, let's say, that would always fire action potentials when the monkey would pick up a raisin and eat it. So they identified that as a raisin eating neuron. And then they were startled one day when a researcher picked up a raisin as if he were going to eat it. And those same neurons in the monkey brain lit up, started firing, as if the monkey itself were picking up the raisin. And they call them mirror neurons because the neurons seem to mirror the action of the researcher rather than just the monkey. And those neurons become active in action observation. If you see someone else do something, your brain does the same thing on a somewhat smaller scale. For example, if you're walking down the sidewalk and the person in front of you gets hit in the back of the head with a frisbee, you sort of go, ouch, as if you felt the pain. That's your mirror neurons functioning.
Right. So it's kind of like what was happening when William's friend walked onto the basketball court and saw him fire off some shots. Yeah, not only gave his brain a whole thing on what you do with your hands and everything.
Right.
So I don't know who we need. How do you figure out how the neuroscience of this works in terms of translating it to therapy? Is there somebody in the middle, a therapist or something that figures this out? I mean, they basically told me to stare at my hands, and after I think it was the second day, I got a little teeny blip of a movement, what William would call a flicker movement. I showed it to them. They were all excited. And I kind of looked at them, or in my mind, looked at them the same way I did when they told me to stare at my hand, because I didn't think very much of a 1/16 or an eighth of an inch of movement. But as I've since learned, it's voluntary. And so we're not trying to confuse everybody with neuroscience. What we're trying to say is that these techniques are valid and they work in stroke recovery. But the main thing I know about the process was getting my hand open, and that process was funny because I could move my fingers, but I couldn't get my hand out of my lap for a long time. But I started that process early on, and I think because I've talked to a few other people that started getting their hand moving early on, I think that flicker of movement came within about 10 days after my stroke. So the earlier you can get something going, I think the better. And this is a way that worked for me, and I know it, but I'm trying to figure out who would be the one who would know how to take this neuroscience and turn it into, practical therapies and explain it. So
The point you just made, Ralph, was very good. That is, the timing of the movement or the action observation or imagination is important. Now, actually, in the early stages of movement, you may not be able to actually move your hand, but you can still imagine moving your hand. So that's really when the imagination comes in most handy. But you could use it anytime. You could use imaginary movement decades after your stroke if you want to improve, because it activates the areas of the brain that are important in moving that finger or hand or whatever.
See, I totally associate the whole thing with getting my hand back, which was thrilling for me, and so it's interesting to hear that you can do it. Well, it's any scientific concept. If it works at one point, it's going to work at another point, unless there's something else that changes. I mean, if it works, that's the way your brain works. It'll work that way.
Well, yeah, but you're after a stroke, the damaged area has a heightened ability to repair itself within the first 3 to 6 months, certainly the first year. It then loses that heightened ability, but the possibility never vanishes until you die. The possibility is still there, but the older you are and the longer out you are from the stroke, the more difficult it is, but it is never impossible.
Right, and the 6 months or a year is where the myth about you have to get better in that period. You definitely have more neuroplasticity closer to the insult, as the doctors like to say.
Yes.
But I've done stuff 10, 11 years out. I couldn't wiggle my toes. I noticed it 12 years out and figured out how to do that. In about a month, I got full range of motion back. So, I mean, and I've shot video of it. So, I know that to be true. Unfortunately, a lot of people either misinterpret it or flat out told, you're not going to get better after 6 months. I wish we could get to all the people that say that and tell them not to say it, but that's a tall order. William, what are you thinking there?
Well, I mean, I think it's true. I think obviously the first year of recovery, that's when most neuroplastic changes happen, and obviously the longer you're out, there are a lot of factors which come into play which actually stop that neuroplastic change from actually happening. Obviously you have muscle spasticity, and also a lot of things are happening, such as maybe your brain has been conditioned to send more signals than necessary to certain muscles, and you've accumulated some learned habits which may not be beneficial for your recovery or might be counterproductive. I think that if you're in that stage, especially in the early stage of your recovery after stroke in that first year, you want to maximize your opportunities to expose the brain to situations where you can encourage more of that neuroplastic change to happen. For example, through things like mental practice or mental imagery, because these can quite often, sometimes exercises like mental imagery or mental practice, they can do something. They can wake up parts of the brain which were maybe dormant after your stroke, and perhaps Bruce can talk more about this. I believe it's called a masking of connections which you might have thought were lost after your stroke. So I think that it is actually quite powerful. It is actually quite powerful to consider mental imagery in recovery after stroke, because it can help your brain to get back that neuroplastic change that maybe you might have lost after that first year of stroke, or it might have gotten weaker after the early days of your stroke recovery. What do you think, Bruce?
Well, yes, that's true. And if we're going to talk about stroke recovery, we should also at least just briefly mention the difference between ischemic strokes and hemorrhagic strokes. An ischemic stroke, where a blood vessel closes versus hemorrhagic, where a blood vessel bursts. In an ischemic stroke, the central core of the stroke has a penumbra around it, an area surrounding it where neurons are damaged but not dead. And those neurons, for the most part, have the capacity to come back online and resume their functioning after the blood flows back into the penumbra area. In contrast, a hemorrhagic stroke does not have a penumbra. You have a central core, but no area where neurons can come back online. So, in one sense, it's more difficult, therefore, to recover from a hemorrhagic stroke than an ischemic stroke. It's also true that in the first year of recovery, taking an antidepressant, in particular an SSRI, that is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, will help recovery from a stroke. That's probably because through a chemical chain of events, SSRIs increase the production of BDNF, that's brain-derived neurotrophic factor. That's a chemical that acts like Miracle-Gro in the brain. It encourages the health of neurons, and that's what relieves depression, and also helps in stroke recovery. Exercise is very important in stroke recovery. Exercise helps promote stroke recovery also by producing BDNF. It's a chemical change that ultimately produces that. So taking the antidepressant during the same time will potentiate or help the effects of the exercise during the first year.
If you want to go all out, you can concentrate on your diet and your gut genome, because your gut genome talks to your brain and is responsible for producing the serotonin in coordination. Your brain does it, but there's a coordination going on there. So my understanding, the healthier your gut genome is, the more likely you are to produce serotonin. And there's some folks that actually think that intermittent fasting helps with BDNF, in the sense that, like, if you're wandering around the savannah and there's no food for a while, when you get like slightly stressed, that the brain says, I got to do something. It goes into survival mode. I'm getting into the amygdala and stuff that I don't know what I'm talking about. But supposedly your brain goes, well, I got to find some food, and your brain creates BDNF sometimes when you're from intermittent fasting.
I'm not familiar with that. I'm not saying it's false, but I'm not saying it's true either. I do not know.
Yeah, well, and I'm tossing it out there. I know there's a connection between the gut genome, so, and it's never a bad idea to be concerned about your diet and your gut genome after a stroke, because a lot of people got into trouble being diabetic, having high cholesterol, issues that a good diet helps. And that's why I said, in my intro, there some people that believe it. I think there's some studying going on. We'll see. I'm not like you, Dr. Hetzler. I'm not familiar with any studies I've seen, but I've got a well-respected friend of mine who's a PT who does intermittent fasting. He feels like it helps him.
Can't come up, but one thing that is good sleep. because your brain consolidates information during sleep. So if you want your brain to recover from all the exercise or mental imagery or action observation, it will do so while you're asleep. So get a good night's sleep.
So does that happen? I think I have some understanding, but I want to clarify it for everybody out there who doesn't know much about sleep and everything. Consolidation is when when the brain decides what it's going to store long term and what it's going to toss out for the day. I mean, that's
Yes.
simple.
Yeah, long-term storage. Yes.
Right. So the importance of this would be that you want to, if you did, 1,000 deep knee bends, you want your brain to store that and not throw it out, so that you only have to do 900 tomorrow. Bad joke, but anyway. So does this occur during like deep sleep or REM sleep or normal sleep? It seemed to me.
Generally, in many ways, so-called deep sleep, stages 3 and 4, are the most important stages. It's during stages 3 and 4 that are important, but memories are also stored during REM sleep. So REM sleep and deep sleep are both important. So you want to get a good night's sleep. Your basic deep sleep, stages 3 and 4, occurs early in the night, in the first hour and a half or so. Your REM periods get longer and longer over the course of the night. So you want to sleep well at the start of the night and at the end of the night.
Right. I've noticed my watch and phone keep track. I've noticed the REM sleep. You almost always have a REM sleep like right before you wake up. I think that's why you can remember your dreams.
Yes.
So if that was a name two things Final Jeopardy, I would have got both of them right, both deep sleep and REM.
That
And
is correct.
deep sleep, I see a lot less on mine. I don't know. I think it's harder. I'm guessing here. I think it's might be harder to get good deep sleep, or it is for me. I don't. I see about half the time I see it, and it is always early on.
Yeah,
So
deep sleep stages 3 and 4 occur early in the night. And that stage of sleep plays a big role in cleaning the brain. Uh, there are channels in the brain that open up, and the brain gets literally washed with cerebrospinal fluid, and that washes away toxic compounds like beta amyloid, which is involved in Alzheimer's disease. So it really, having a good stage 3 and 4 of sleep will help protect you from developing Alzheimer's disease.
so glial cells are nocturnal, huh? That probably requires a big explanation.
Well, there are 3 types of glial cells. There are astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, and microglia. The microglia are part of the immune system. The oligodendrocytes produce the myelin that surrounds the axons. The myelin makes the message that one neuron transmits to another neuron go faster. It's the myelin that surrounds the axon that is destroyed in multiple sclerosis. The astrocytes sort of form a network and support the neurons. They will transfer things from the blood supply to the neuron. And it is channels between astrocytes that open up during stages 3 and 4 of sleep that allow the cerebrospinal fluid to wash away the beta amyloid.
Okay, so bottom line is believe that you can do it. Mental imagery works. SSRIs can help. Get a good night's sleep. Doesn't hurt to eat well because your gut genome can help with the serotonin production. And as if you didn't have enough to worry about having had a stroke and trying to figure out how to get better, I mean, there's a bunch more information we're piling on you, but it's all good information. I'm a big believer in this. I was glad to meet Dr. Hetzler and find out more about it. I learned a couple of things tonight for sure. I didn't know there were 3 kinds of glial cells. I thought there was one kind that cleaned up messes. So I imagined all these nocturnal glial cells cleaning up the mess from the day. But, you know, when I know something about it and I can tell people to try it and I know that there have been studies and I know it works and you can say athletes use it and stuff, it makes it a lot more believable. Like I said early on, when I used to tell people, well, just in my video, several of my early videos, it just says, and think hard. And I always would tell people, you know, while you're doing that, think hard about it, especially with passive motion. This is real important. After you get voluntary motion, even minimally, or even before you do, you can use mental practice in terms of passive motion, opening your other hand. You can, you know, eventually imagine that you're doing it and try using less and less pressure to do it and see if you can transfer some of the passive into active. So, William, you have anything else you want to add?
No, not really. I mean, I just think for all the folks who are watching this, you know, whichever stage of recovery you're in, really, really take to heart some of the things which we discussed in this roadmap. Mental imagery, I believe, can be really powerful when used right. And I think that obviously to stimulate that more production of BDNF, as Bruce mentioned, especially if you're serious about getting more neuroplasticity, some of the things we mentioned here on this roadmap, they would be quite useful in helping to facilitate that, to help you move further along in your recovery after stroke.
All right, good summary. So, I want to thank Dr. Hetzler for joining us this week. Maybe this will become a new thing. We're not going to necessarily make you come back, Dr. Hetzler, every week, but we've kicked around the idea of maybe, you know, bringing in somebody who has some expertise on a subject. So this was a bit of an experiment. I think it went well, and want to thank you for giving your time, Dr. Hetzler, and everybody out there. I guess we'll see you next time.
Okay, thank you, Ralph.